Welcome back. Now, it remains to be seen whether suspended ANC Secretary-General Magashule will adhere to the party NEC's directive that he should apologise publicly to party structures for issuing ANC President Cyril Ramaphosa with a suspension letter. Now, last week, after being suspended for failing to step aside in line with the NEC resolution that members who face criminal charges must volunteer to step aside or face suspension, Magashule instead issued a suspension letter to the president, and this without any mandate or authorisation from any party structure. The ANC has also resolved to revise and adopt guidelines for the selection of candidates to represent the party in the upcoming local government elections. Meanwhile, the South African Communist Party, that's the SACP, says that it will also follow the ANC in taking the necessary measures against its members should they be charged with corruption or serious crimes in a court of law. Political analyst Gogo Aubrey Matshiqi joins us now to take a keener look and unpack some of these developments within the ruling party. Aubrey, good morning. Togoza. So let's just start by looking at what transpired over the weekend in the NEC meeting. And there's a lot of talk about leaks this morning. ANC NEC leaks, for example, trending quite high up on the trending list. But of course, it all speaks to the balance of forces within the party, always an issue, but especially following the 2017 Nasrec conference, that victory by a very narrow margin has always meant that the balance of forces in the party becomes significant. Talk to us about your observations in this regard.
Well, the leaks during the NEC meeting were quite interesting, Sakina, because this time the leaks were happening in real time. In other words, you did not have to wait for a discussion to conclude before you benefited from a leak. They were happening in real time. Clearly, there was an attempt by some inside the ANC to influence either the narrative about what was going on inside the meeting, that is on the part of those who were on the outside in society, or to create a particular perception of what the discussion was about, of who is in control, and therefore who were the villains and who were the heroes in the saga. But as you say, Cyril Ramaphosa came out of the Nasrec conference with a very slight margin of victory, which meant that there was an extent to which he would never be able to make difficult decisions without the consent of his opponents and enemies in the party, particularly in the National Executive Committee of the ruling party. And one of the challenges he faced was the challenge of neutralizing Magashule, a Secretary-General who did not support him. And like him, after the Mangaung conference, the challenge was to make sure that at some point before the next conference, this time in 2022, he no longer has the problem of a Secretary-General of the ANC with whom he does not sing from the hymn sheet, from the same hymn sheet. But what we have with the demand that Magashule should apologize, first of all, is the appearance of magnanimity on the part of the faction, the Tumamina faction, which in my view is in control of the NEC. Because at face value, it would appear that the NEC has decided to give Magashule a chance to escape expulsion from the ruling party. Because remember, Magashule faces two challenges at the moment. The first challenge is that of staying out of jail, and the second challenge is that of avoiding expulsion from the ANC. So at face value, the demand that he must apologize to the president offers him a chance to avoid the second. But it must be said, Sakina, that when Magashule wrote that letter suspending Cyril Ramaphosa, that was a suicidal step. That's one way of reading it. Another way of reading it is that he was trying to deepen the crisis in his favor, but thirdly, it may have been an attempt to test the level of support that exists for him and the RET forces within the party. But overall, in my view, that step was a step akin to action by a kamikaze pilot, and therefore was a suicidal step.
So where does that leave the Secretary-General of the party now? Well, suspension issues aside, the fact that he's asked to apologise to the structures of the ANC, and this, of course, could be seen by some as a trap. Because is it a case of he's doomed if he does and he's doomed if he doesn't?
Well, if he apologizes, he will appear weak, and those who support him may feel compromised. On the other hand, if he apologizes, that would be similar to a ceasefire. And remember, during a ceasefire, you can have the opportunity to rearm. And therefore, he might want to tactically apologize. And remember, he is suspended. That gives him and those who support him to use this period of the appearance of a ceasefire to rearm themselves and prepare for the next battle in the NEC and in the ANC as a whole. If he does not apologize, well, then the door will be open for a disciplinary process against him, which disciplinary process may culminate in his expulsion from the ANC. Now, all of this suggests that President Cyril Ramaphosa, as I keep on saying, has an advantage in terms of the balance of support and the balance of forces within the NEC. The question is whether his advantage is reflected in the branches of the ANC and whether it is reflected in society. My suspicion is that the president still has an approval rating in society that is higher than his approval rating within the party itself. So if there is a disjuncture between the balance of support for President Cyril Ramaphosa in the NEC, in the NEC and branches of the ANC, all of this humiliation, that is the humiliation that Ace Magashule is suffering, may backfire on the president and the Tumamina faction. Only if we are not exaggerating the level of political support inside the party for Ace Magashule, because if we are, we may never see Ace Magashule in the position of Secretary-General of the ANC again.
So let's look at the ANC overall and the structures of the party. Interestingly, in those very real-time leaks that we alluded to earlier, one of those that came out over the weekend was a recording of former President Thabo Mbeki, for example, addressing that virtual NEC. And one of the questions he asks is there still an organization called the ANC? What did you make of that? And what was that question about?
Well, Sakina, to me, that was not a real question. It was a statement. In other words, this was a rhetorical question. Is there still an organization called the ANC? Is a statement about the state of the organization. But either consciously or otherwise, the former president threw the current president of the ANC under the bus and the NEC as a whole under the bus. Because that statement, that question, cannot be interpreted as a vote of confidence in the leadership of Ramaphosa and the leadership of the NEC as a whole.
So what does this mean then for the organization? And why ask a rhetorical question? And how does that move the organization forward?
Well, the former president and others in the NEC meeting, and as you have seen in what was announced yesterday as the outcomes of the NEC meeting, went beyond asking that rhetorical question and called for some kind of consultative meeting. In my view, a consultative meeting that will be attended only by members of the NEC is not going to help, because you are just going to have another 3 or 4 days of a retreat, during which the battles we've seen over the past few months will play themselves again. So a retreat attended only by members of the NEC is not going to help. What you need is the NEC seeking the guidance of the basic structures of the party, that is the branches. In other words, such a retreat should include some representation from branches. But if you ask me, what you need is a Morogoro-like type of consultative conference that will be attended, yes, by members of the ANC, yes, by branches of the ANC, but also by current and former members of the ANC who are currently not in the structures of leadership.
You speak about Morogoro, and in some way takes us to this question about what Dakota Legwete mentions in this meeting. He asks the question about how or why, for example, some people who were mentioned at the Zondo Commission have already been acted upon by law enforcement authorities, while others haven't. And he invokes the name of Vincent Smith, for example. Now, I found that quite interesting in that it raises a question once again about the minorities within the ANC and how seemingly they are treated, whether rightly or wrongly, that perception does exist, not only within but also outside of the ANC, Aubrey. So how did you read that particular input by Dakota?
Well, Sakina, you and I last year in an interview prefigured this question when I cautioned that what must not happen is the arrest of some and not the arrest of others, thus leading to the perception that our criminal justice system, the NPA in particular, has consciously or unconsciously become a component of factional battles in the ANC. What we must bear in mind, Sakina, is that institutions such as the NPA do anticipate the wishes of incoming leadership. In other words, they do anticipate the desires of the new leadership. So what appears to be a change in the direction of the decisions they make about who should be prosecuted or not may actually be the continuation of an old dynamic. And so when we praise the NPA for changing direction, we may be doing so simply because we like the new leadership, not because the DNA that informs the choices that are made by such an institution has changed. But you raise the question of minorities. There is now an emerging argument that not only does it seem that the NPA is engaging in selective prosecution. And before I continue, the invocation of selective prosecution is not a defense, Sakina, but selective prosecution is a problem. So a perception is emerging among some in the party that those who are black in general, in other words, those are not African in particular, may to some extent be the target. But that is countered by those who argue that to the extent that corruption seems to have a black face in South Africa, the preponderance of those against whom allegations of corruption are made are those who are African in particular.
So where does this leave the ANC overall? given that the president himself at some point said the ANC is accused number one. We've seen evidence led before the Zondo Commission yet again, where it's been ANC members day in, day out, and arguments made for and against. But in general, listening to Lucky Montana again yesterday, talking about how the ANC, how CEOs of state-owned entities, for example, would just ordinarily be summoned to Luthuli House and money is being channeled to the party. All of this is now public knowledge. I think we knew that it was happening, but it is now right there with the evidence to bear. So where does this leave the ANC as a leader in society?
The ANC, first of all, Sakina, cannot credibly be called, or itself cannot regard itself as a leader of society. It is not. It is in such a state of decline that at the moment it is incapable of providing leadership on anything. President Cyril Ramaphosa is correct when he says the ANC is accused number one when it comes to corruption, which means actually the party as a whole should step aside. By that I mean we keep on concentrating on what is going on inside the ruling party as if change in South African society is contingent exclusively on what is going on inside the ANC. The point I'm making is that while the ANC itself is busy focusing inwardly, there is a process of decoupling that is happening. Decoupling between the interests of ordinary citizens and the interests of the ANC. The ANC will turn around, and I think we are a few years away from that, and find that the so-called key motive force of the revolution, the people, are no longer behind it. In other words, there is an extent to which the dynamics inside the ANC are becoming irrelevant in relation to this dynamic of decoupling. And therefore, change in South African society is not exclusively contingent on what is going on inside the ANC. And that is why the president and those who support him must take cold comfort from the fact that the level of support and the balance of support favors them, because they are in charge of a sinking ship. And therefore, you can't say that faction and the president himself are strong when they are in charge of an ANC that is in decline, a sinking ship.
Well, we have to leave it there, but appreciate your insights as always. Gogo Aubrey Matshiqi is, of course, a political analyst talking to us about some of the developments within the African National Congress. And with that, it's the news time at 7. Leanne standing by with that.